conversation. Sidney Hargro of the Philanthropy Network, Kat Rosqueta of Center for High Impact Philanthropy at the University of Pennsylvania. Kat, Sidney, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here.
Great to be
Thanks,
here.
Chris. Hey, Sidney.
Hey, Kat, how are you?
Good.
So you guys have an incredible dashboard that I want us to spend a lot of time talking about. Sabrina and I just got done highlighting some of the reporting Generosity has been doing over the last year, and it's been in large part informed by much of the work you're doing. I wonder if you could like level set with us so far. We are clearly in the thick still of whatever we're going to call this, recovery, relief, the fall. We'll get to that. I wonder if you guys have initial reactions sitting here right now. What do we learn from the last 6 to 8 months? Do you have any like initial readings on the place of things? Where are we in the woods?
So I'll start, and I'll start using the way the team at the Center for High Impact Philanthropy always thinks of crises. So for 13 years, our team has looked at disasters, and they can be natural disasters like an earthquake or hurricane. They can be man-made disasters like conflict in the Middle East or a refugee issue. And in a lot of ways, COVID is both. And we always think of recovery as following a set of phases. So there's the immediate relief, urgent, life-saving relief that you must provide as soon as the crisis is known. Then communities normally go into a period where the community is stable, somewhat stable, and we're trying to pick up the pieces, and that's typically referred to as the recovery phase. Then once we have taken stock of what's happened, things are stable, and we can start seeing how to rebuild. And the best communities build back better because there's a cycle. There will always be another crisis. And so if you build back better, that means the community, our community, is that much more resilient to whatever comes next. The problem with COVID is, just as you said, Chris, we are not out of the woods.
Yeah.
Right? So that true recovery and build back better is still far, far ahead of us. And we're still learning and trying to learn as fast as we can, where we need to provide relief, who desperately needs the relief, and are there opportunities that even in the midst of this crisis that we can think about systems that are going to help us for the longer term.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, just continuing with the idea of, disaster relief and funding and philanthropy, I think it's in typical cases, the funding surges initially, and then it tails off, I think, right around at the 6-month mark. And we're very much getting close to a year now of trying to figure out when this thing is going to get to a point where it even feels like it's behind us. And so one of the major questions I think, for philanthropy related to that is, to what degree do we build back better, right? Like, what are the things that were put in place to respond with flexibility, with less onerous reporting, with digging deeper into our resources, et cetera? Like, to what degree are those behaviors permanent, or is it a temporary pivot? Because I think because this is going for a much longer period, those are the questions that nonprofits are asking. Do we know that you're still here because you were there then? And so that's something that I'm hearing.
Jan, in the background, I wonder if you can throw up, we're going to aim to do a couple, 1 or 2 poll questions for each conversation today to make sure get feedback. If we can throw up that first poll question, and you can drop off the screen share and just have us in conversation. So this question is a theme that we at Generosity are trying to do a lot of, which is challenging us all to feel like we are part of the solution. And so we have to self-assess here too. Don't blame everybody else. How are we doing? So the question here is on a scale of 1 to 5. How are we in the collective relative to your own belief? Like, this is about what your expectations are. How are we doing relative to our own expectations? Scale of 1 to 5. 1, this is the worst possible effort we could be putting out. 5, this is the best possible given the world we are in. And folks, why don't you submit your answers to that, and on the back end of it, Sidney, Kat, and I can talk a little bit. And it's talking about right now. We don't have to look into the future. I think this is a right now kind of thing, because this is moving on us a lot. And like, while we get those poll results, we'll give folks a minute or so to give an answer. Kat, Sidney, Sabrina and I got into a little bit, and Kat, you alluded to these phases, and it does feel like that's one reason why it's hard to self-assess, because these are a lot of chapters. How did we respond? Like, oh man, this is happening, and gets me out of the gate, versus a summer versus now. You gave us those phases, Kat. How do you actually do you bound us in chapters? Like, what timeline do you picture us being in?
Yep. I think we are, we've learned a lot. And so I would not put us in that acute, immediate relief phase.
Yeah.
Right? We are starting to figure out things that will help. So I would not put us smack dab in the recovery, because I think it requires a level of stability and a little more predictability that we have now. And we certainly don't. For example, schools that had been hybrid just learned yesterday back to full virtual, right? So we're not quite at the recovery. So in terms of the chapters, we have the acute relief phase a little behind us. And if we manage well, it will stay behind us, but we're for sure not in the recovery phase. So that would be just comparing this to other historical crises that other communities have weathered. That's where I'd put us.
I'm tortured sometimes when a friend of mine likes to point out that World War II was a 5-year window, or like he likes to rattle through these windows, and I tell him to stop texting me at midnight.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned, and I'm just staring at this poll and thinking, how would you self-assess? I have to say, in that immediate relief phase, at least the philanthropic community, and big shout out to Sidney and his colleagues at Philanthropy Network, they recognized the need to galvanize quickly and collaborate. And so, that's one of the things that can help a community handle a crisis of the scale is you can't get through this alone, right? Quickly figuring out how to start working together, quickly having conversations with other helpers to see, okay, we can each help in these ways, but boy, this is too big if we're not coordinating the way we help. I would say that because we have anchor groups and institutions like Philanthropy Network and some of the folks that are participating, there was a degree of early coordination that served our community quite well.
Before we hear from Sidney, Anna, are you able to pull the survey results up just so we can see how folks are self-assessing? So yeah, shockingly, we're right in the middle. And I guess I get that, because I think there is I wonder if how many of us have this sense of like, I don't know, it doesn't seem good, but we're not. Well, I won't make any more of a joke. Sidney, any thoughts on where we, 100 or so nonprofit professionals in the region are self-assessing?
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I think the reality is that no one feels like we're there yet, right? No one feels like it's behind us. Not even in their immediate day-to-day, the resources that they need. So much is uncertain now. I think 2 to 3 is like recognizing the uncertainty that people are facing. And quite frankly, there's so much that there's so much that we know. We're much better off now. And certainly, like through this partnership with Kat and Chip, like there are things that we know, but there's also so much that we don't know, right? Like we don't know what sectors are most likely are based on a stress test, right, are getting ready to really hit the wall in January or February. And those are the things, and I think that angst, creates a 3 or a 2. Like I don't really know.
Yeah, I think that's right. Kat, well, so I'm quite fixated on these phases, right? Like we've done tons of reporting around the small business relief, both federally and statewide, locally, in a very narrow band. And for all of its many faults, we moved quickly, and then we've just stalled, and they're just like, and we cannot agree on anything at a lot of different levels. We've tried to parse out what is good. We kind of at Generosity feel like it's unproductive to just say everything is bad all the time. We don't think that's particularly helpful. So I wonder if you guys can feel out like what are the things that we locally, regionally, what has been okay, and in an era like this, it almost seems controversial to have to say something went well, and you might get yourself in some trouble. So I'm asking you for the dangerous question of what is something that has gone reasonably well considering the constraints we are in.
So I'll focus on what we learned from the dashboard, because that's the most concrete.
And I want to make sure we get some chat in the chat. Make sure we point to the dashboard work you guys are doing. Let's put some. That's perfect. Well, go ahead, Kat.
So what we learned was that overall, the philanthropic response, if you come, what do we always hope for a philanthropic response? We hope that it is aligned well with known needs, right? Because that's the first thing. If the money isn't going to where the need exists, well, then you've missed your opportunity to have impact. So that frankly was the whole point of the dashboard, was to get more information on how well did the philanthropic response align with needs. And at the highest level, what we found was money flowed to where there was the highest apparent need that could be measured by things like COVID case rates and the social vulnerability index, which is a composite measure of all sorts of things, including housing insecurity and food insecurity, et cetera. So at the highest level, the philanthropic funds did pretty much align, and we took a regional look to those counties where you saw high COVID case rates as a proportion of population, high social vulnerability. Right, so that's a good thing. The other good thing we saw was that there was a very quick response, and that is always key to address speed. Speed is king when it comes to trying to address a crisis. And what you're seeing now,
just pull up these are slides. Yeah.
So this gives you a sense of where the over $40 million of philanthropic funds went. And when this is a great slide. When I mentioned speed, there were 13 shared funds that got stood up in 13 days, starting in mid-March. That is a level of mobilization that is wonderful to see. And remember, they're shared funds. So this just isn't just one foundation or one funder. Each of those funds required some form of collaboration.
Yeah.
So that's another good thing, is speed and collaboration. So I would put those as like at a high level. What did we do well? Looking at the known needs, at least at the level of the county, we were aligning where the philanthropic funds went well. And in terms of our speed to respond and our ability to respond, not in completely isolated ways, but in these shared funds that all got stood up within 13 days, we did that pretty well.
Yeah,
Sidney,
I think. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna. You're on it. Yep.
Yeah, I think that and part of the reason I think why the ability for those funds to be stood up so quickly is the individual funders also pivoted much quicker than we've ever seen. I've certainly seen in my entire career, and they pivoted in the right ways, the ways that we know are most effective. They immediately started to get their boards together to meet more often. They weren't meeting quarterly. They were meeting, some of them were meeting weekly or every other week. And they decided to convert project grants to operating grants immediately for those grants that were out there. They immediately said that people nonprofits can't be focused on reporting, so they either suspended it for a time or simplified it. And basically this notion of getting funders to be nimble really was realized, right? And so they're saying, and I think that helped the funds, because many of those funders not only did that with their grantees, but they said we also have to be a part of the whole. We also have to collaborate with other funders. We also have to support not one, but probably 2 or 3 different funds based on the issue area. And that level of flexibility, again, going back to what I said earlier, is like, to what degree is that going to be permanent, right? This level of flexibility to not only get through COVID, but even as we at some point see recovery.
Sherry Cole dropped a question in the chat. Call out to all of you, please make sure drop questions in the chat. Elsewhere, we love the activity. And she has a few questions here, and I want to take a piece of them, and I think we might hit a couple different. I might break up her question, but something that are one of the many reasons that 2020 is weird is we've had a giant economic shock, and something like 12 million people are still on some degree of unemployment. But the stock market's still smiling. And I think we had lots of off-the-record conversations of, fund managers and family offices and lots in philanthropy. In March, we were like, oh man, we're going to watch stock market tank. We have to manage our giving. But that hasn't happened. I wonder if you guys are seeing, is philanthropy responding to this incredibly perverse dichotomy between high performing endowments and incredible need? Is the giving looking unprecedented, as I presume from the outside that it ought to? Is that something that we're seeing?
So I'll share a few observations, and of course I'm not aware, Sidney might be aware of any research or analysis that's going across all those many foundations and endowments. I have not seen anything like that yet, but here are a few things to consider. One is that there has been a lot of momentum because of this crisis to do exactly what Sidney described, which is to recognize that funders could do better, and by doing better, meaning could achieve greater progress and impact if they are more flexible in the way they provide funding to nonprofits. And more flexible means less restricted in terms of being time bound, less restricted in terms of thinking of general operating support. So one of the silver linings, in a way, of this crisis is that it was so harmful, and so many nonprofits had the demand for their services spike just as they were stretched with their own capacity, that it prompted funders to work with them more flexibly and more in partnership. And so that's one. The second is, even without the increase in endowment because of great, capital markets, there were lots of conversations on foundation boards saying, is this when we need to think about drawing down our endowments more than we historically have? So it was less about the increase in the stock market and more about the need in the community that prompted these boards to start thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
I would totally agree, Kat. And I think, although I'm unaware of any, research across the board, certainly in the region, about how, funders are thinking about their endowments, what I've seen anecdotally was just what you said. Like, it was the need for to step up at a high level now, and then think about the endowment after the fact. And to go back to the question in the chat, I think that's a question that we'll see answered probably in the first half of next year, is to what degree, because the need for supporting things that are not necessarily directly COVID, but maybe results of that in a variety of different priority areas, are impacted by COVID indirectly. like that funding is going to be needed as well. And the only way to really look at that is whether or not we really rethink this idea of how much of that endowment can go toward this need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just noting for attendees at 10 a.m. in 8 minutes, we're gonna flip us all into small 5-person-ish breakout groups, and we're gonna have conversations. We're aiming to make this half-day conference as interactive as possible. So you will we want to hear what you're doing in your own work, talk with others about it, and then you will get a break, and we'll come back to the next session. So just keep that in mind. You can drop questions here for Sidney and Kat in the chat, and you'll certainly get to talk about them as well. So the actual question of this conversation we're having, and what we're then going to put everyone into small breakout groups to talk about, is basically how we doing. And we chose a session a month ago. I think it would have been answered very differently than now. But as we all keep circling, pandemic, economic shock, most consequential conversation on racial equity we've had in at least a generation. We all watched Philadelphia is still at this exact moment one of the most consequential centers of democracy in the world right now. The stakes are really, and it is exacerbating existing chronic issues across the board. Are we just, or do we have any, as a collective group of leaders, are we just on a ride right now? Do we have any leadership control or influence on what's happening in these matters? Do we have control over any of these crises? Forget about recovery. Is this happening to us, or are we doing something?
Well, so I go back to, I think it was a question you made early on, Chris. I sort of feel like I have no data to answer that empirically. I do know that unless we think of ourselves as having agency and leadership, we will not get through this. So I think what I would encourage everyone to do is claim what agency you have. And this, one of the pieces of work that our team did about 18 months ago was called We the People, How Philanthropy Can Strengthen Democracy. And that's available for free on our website. And one of the big lessons learned is one of the powers of a democratic system, which is what we live in, is that while individuals have a voice, it's the collective voice that shifts for change. And so I think, part of what COVID has done is it impacted not those. There were certainly people who were made extremely vulnerable and even more vulnerable because of COVID. What's been so hard is that those of us who are in positions to help, we were also affected. So the helpers were affected in very similar ways as some of the folks who needed the help. And so, it is our kind of collective leadership, our collective ability to influence. That's what we've we have to exercise, and that's what we have to hold our hopes onto.
Yeah,
I know you had 2 other slides, Kat, so I wanted to just make sure we click through that. But sorry, Sidney, go ahead.
Oh, that's great. No, I couldn't agree more. I think what this moment in Philadelphia, right? There's something about all of the things and the layers of what's happening here right now is also our opportunity. And that opportunity, I don't think, can be seized without an incredibly different relationship with uplifting community voice, uplifting community agency, right? And really, and again, I'm speaking from the standpoint of working in philanthropy. It's different to really say, like, how do you really look at opportunities to engage in with the community at large, and to share power to really realize a newer space, right? To imagine and create a newer space. And if it happens here, it will have ripple effects across the country.
So again, in a couple of minutes, we'll be putting folks into breakout groups. So I want to prime them with some topics. Kat, you have a couple slides here. I wonder if you want to just touch on them.
Yeah, well, so this gets to some of Sydney's remarks about kind of looking forward, right? And what you're seeing now is a screenshot. All these slides are actually screenshots from the public dashboard, which you can visit for free on our website.
And Sabrina put a link in the chat. If folks are looking for that, you go to the chat and
Oh,
there is
great.
a link to it.
And one of the things that you can see are maps of the region, maps of each county, and they took all that grant data we had access to and located them on the map and then compared them to indicators of need like social vulnerability. So what you're seeing here is the more red a census tract is, the more relative grant making went there compared to the need. Doesn't mean the need has been completely satisfied, but it means relatively more. And the more blue a census tract is on the map, the more relative need there was or there is compared to the funding that went to it. So what you're looking at is a lot of blue,
Yeah.
which means there's a lot more need ahead, right? That we have to figure out. And it's not just philanthropy, right? Philanthropy has a very important strategic role that it can play in a region's response. But philanthropic funding, even though $40 million sounds like a lot of money, it's a drop in the ocean compared to public financing, what the government can do, and certainly the resources that the business community has. But at least, we have a picture now of what that early philanthropic response was and how it compares to the need. And then if we want to forward to the next slide, because we have, there've been a lot of comments about how this current crisis has kind of laid bare the racial disparities that have always existed. Part of what will help us navigate that is if we can really see and understand those even more clearly. So from the data that we had available, we were able to look at, were the grantees led by individuals who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, right? Who we know have been disproportionately affected by COVID, right? And this is what we can say now. We can say, for example, that when a funder or a grantee told us about that leadership, there was no apparent difference in the amount of funding they received. Mm-hmm. But look at the percentage, 65%, that didn't even provide that information. Which means if we're trying to align with the leadership that reflects the communities we want to help, we need to do a better job understanding who that leadership is. And ideally, if you collect that data, then everybody can see how well the community is doing.
That's helpful. In a moment, we're going to put folks in breakout groups, but I'm going to eat into the time a little bit just to set things up. For one, calling out that Kat and Sidney, one of the challenges, even at a federal level, this is something, as a business reporting economics nerd like me, this is a very telling story everywhere, that we have a lot of lagging indicators. Our GDP numbers, like so much of what we tend to rely on, are lagging. And this is a fast moving thing. Like our report card from a month ago, how people self-assessed on response looks like it might as well be 1,000 years old. I wonder, as we go into these breakout groups and have folks talk a bit internally about how the just recovery is going, what is something that you would want, if you're basically walking to grab coffee, at this conference, and you bump into someone, when we used to, bump into people, and you hear them talking about how we're doing as a region, what is a nugget that you each would want to make sure is inserted in that conversation to be having a productive and accurate conversation, knowing we're lagging a lot in what we do know? Mm-hmm. Is there something, Kat, Sidney, that you want to arm everyone with, like, to take into their conversations?
Here's one question that builds off the slide you just showed, which is, what's one piece of information that you're going to start collecting today that will give you more confidence that your response is more just than it was before? Just like one piece of information that you're going to start routinely capturing, and that's going to help you say, yep, because we captured that information and we didn't before, we now understand how our response is more just.
Sidney, that was a very effective answer from Kat. I hope you can.
Look. Then you might be disappointed. Well, I mean, I think I actually had a conversation this morning, and even another one earlier in the week, and it was about the question of like, what can philanthropy do beyond its dollars, right? Because we know that dollars are not enough, to really move toward systemic change, right? So there's more than the dollars, like using the philanthropic platform. And so how do we focus? How do we use how does philanthropic efforts include this idea of systemic change, policy advocacy beyond the dollars that they're spending?
I think that's pretty good, Sidney. I think you did great.